It is the harvest season in Ireland, and Dingle Distillery have harvested one really great whiskey for their Lunasa single malt release. Let me tell you about it. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this is the Lunasa single malt whiskey from Dingle. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with, first off, Dingle Distillery, they're a great little distillery in Ireland, in the Dingle Peninsula, in the town of Dingle, in the very south coast of Ireland, and they've been making some very great whiskies for the last few years. They've been in operation for about 10 years, so they have got some 10-year-old stock, but they want to make sure that they've got enough stock for like a core age statement release. So for the last year, they've been releasing this series, the Celtic Wheel of the Year series, and as you can see from the symbols that are yet to be filled up, they go from silver to gold. When they fill up, they got under a year of that, and that's going to bring them into the kind of new cycle where they can have those age statement whiskies. But this right here is the fourth whiskey in that Wheel of the Year release. It's the Lunasa whiskey, and Lunasa in Ireland, if for those of you who aren't aware, it's the month of August, but it's also the kind of fire festival that would mark the start of the harvest time in Ireland in kind of Celtic pagan traditional times, because it literally means like the festival of the god Lugh, Lunasa. So it's a kind of a great little moment where it's the end of the kind of recreational time when the crops are growing and the start of the kind of work season where you're gonna have to harvest your crops, you're gonna have to harvest your grains and various different things. So it's kind of the last big kind of fun time before that hard work begins for the harvest season in Ireland. It is a single malt whiskey that comes in at 101 proof or 50.5% alcohol. It is a limited release, but there's about 10,000 bottles. So in the Celtic Wheel of the Year series so far, the releases sizes, they vary from like very large to kind of smaller. This is definitely one of the larger releases that they've done so far. So it's not going to sell out probably immediately, but I do imagine it will sell out eventually because it's a very nice whiskey. It's about a 7-year-old single malt, and it doesn't have any of those kind of wine finishes or anything like that. The previous releases in the series have had wine or muscatel or Shiraz. They've had kind of those berry fruity finishes. This, however, is a double bourbon aged whiskey, and I don't say it was finished in a fresh bourbon cask because it was aged for about 3.5 years initially in bourbon casks before being finished for 3.5 years, or maybe aged for a second 3.5 year period in a bourbon cask from the Widow Jane distillery. I'll get to the Widow Jane in a second. I've asked Dingle where their original kind of bourbon casks come from, and they come from Maker's Mark, Heaven Hill, Basil Hayden, so they come from a variety of different bourbon casks, but for the finish it was specifically in that Widow Jane bourbon. Now, Widow Jane, new distillery in Brooklyn. I'm not sure they've got any whiskey that's their own stuff that's been fully matured and fully aged. They have been sourcing from Kentucky, and that's where that cask came from. I did find out the mash bill. They didn't tell me exactly what whiskey it was, but it was a 70% corn, 20% rye, and 10% malted barley whiskey from Kentucky. So for any of you bourbon or whiskey noobs out there, or whiskey nerds, sorry, if you know or you have an idea of what that whiskey is, let me know down below, because I'd love to kind of see what it is and see how that influence transferred onto the whiskey, because it's definitely leading with that bourbon, leading with that grain sweetness. This whiskey, it's kind of paying homage to the harvest time. You can even see the symbol on the bottle. I'll put a close-up of it up there. It is like a sheaf of wheat, a sheaf of grains, leaning into that bourbon, leaning into that kind of idea of this is the time for grains, for harvesting, and for making some very good whiskey. So speaking of the whiskey, I think it's time we go in for the nose on the Dingle Lunasa. Cheers. Okay, like I said, it leans into that bourbon influence. It's very sweet on the nose. I'm getting kind of candied, crystallized ginger, a bit of obviously a kind of butterscotch, toffee, caramel, really kind of warm and sweet notes that come through. And that's all sitting on top of a very distinctive malty note. If you've ever tried Dingle's whiskey before, you'll know that their malt has this kind of fruity, herbal, kind of floral character to it. different malts from different distilleries will all have different characters, and Dingle's one has a very distinctive kind of Dingle DNA, and that is definitely coming through here. It is a 7-year-old whiskey. It doesn't really have a huge amount of youth on it. It doesn't really feel like a hugely aged whiskey, just a nice amount of age on it, but definitely that malty character comes through. It's not overshadowed by the bourbon or by the oak or by anything like that. Their official tasting notes say that there's red berries on the nose and some salted caramel. I'm not sure I get the red berries, but I do get that salted caramel. Very, like I said, rich butterscotch, toffee, creamy, and with that little bit of the herbal note from that Dingle malt, it definitely has that kind of a savory, sweet note that does remind me of salted caramel. Other than that, it's just got a nice amount of kind of warming spices. Like I said, nothing like overly jumping out, kind of like a candied or crystallized ginger. It's not like a load of cinnamon or a load of nutmeg or anything on the nose. It's just a nice warming kind of approachable nose. So I think I'm going to go in for the palate and see how that develops. Cheers. On the palate, oh, there's a nice amount of flavor in there. It does feel like it is a nicely proofed whiskey. It doesn't feel hot, it doesn't feel like it's burning, but just you can feel the weight, you can feel the depth of the whiskey coming in at 50.5%. Quite nice, quite rich, not overly hot, it'll be burning you, but giving you a lot of flavor in there. It leads up front with sweetness, with that initial hit of that caramel, but then as it spreads out across your palate, you get a little bit of oak spice, you get a little bit of that kind of I wouldn't necessarily say like a bourbon-y note where you get that maybe, you know, the peanut brittle or things like that, but definitely a bit of that bourbon influence. It's a little bit peanutty, it's a little bit of that kind of oak spice coming through, not a huge amount, just a little bit of that coming through, and that's all on top of that rich butterscotch, the caramel, the vanilla, like leading in. Like bourbon casks do give you, especially for Irish whiskey, they give you a lot of that kind of vanilla, creamy, sweet notes, and that's what it is here. You get kind of fudgy notes. It's quite a creamy, rich mouthfeel that does deliver a nice bit of spice, a nice bit of kind of a bit of heat, not, you know, as I said, a little bit of warming, not a huge amount, but just quite nice and kind of deep. So I'm going to go in again and see what else I can find, because as I was sitting with it, as I was kind of letting it sit, I got a little bit of kind of a tingly note, so I'm going to go in again. Cheers. Yeah, so as I said, you get that bourbon, you get that sweetness, you get that influence, and then you get this kind of tingly note. Their tasting notes say lemon sherbet, and I'm inclined to agree. It has that kind of almost fizzy note on the palate. Made that combination probably of that sweetness and that herbal note with that kind of oaky spice combines to be a little bit tingly on the tongue. Again, not hot, just kind of tingly, almost like the feeling you get from peppercorns, but without the pepper spice. So if you know that kind of the tingly feeling you get in your tongue from like proper cracked black pepper, but just without the flavor of the pepper, that kind of tingle is there on the palate as you sit with it. And you still get that kind of candied, caramelized, or crystallized ginger note in there. Warming spices, not hot, not really baking spices, just nice amount of warming spices on the palate. And then as I'm talking, I can feel the finish. It kind of goes in a different direction, a bit darker, a bit more kind of cocoa powder, maybe dark coffee. So I'm going to go in again, another sip, but focus on that finish. Cheers. Okay, so as I said, sweetness up front, creamy butter fudge. Then you get that bit of that kind of the lemon sherbety note, candied crystallized ginger, and then on the finish, as it kind of fades away, I would say kind of the oaky spice note lingers a bit. I can feel that oak. It's kind of like a really like 95% cocoa, like a really, really dark, rich chocolate bar where you got that little bit of milk, maybe that little bit of sugar elevating it up, but it's still a really, really rich, dark cocoa, like really dark chocolate note coming through. And then that itself does fade off. As I'm talking, that note has faded away, just leaving me with a nice kind of sweet base. Like, as I said, this is double bourbon, it's bourbon on bourbon. It might not sound like the most exciting of kind of finishes, it might not sound like the most exciting of profiles, but you definitely do get that nice kind of bourbon and bourbon note where you get that extra sweetness. It really doubles up on the flavor you get from just a standard 7 years in one cask. And even though it isn't the most exciting of whiskies, like I said, I think so far in the release series, this might be my favorite from the whiskey of the Wheel of the Year series that Dingle have been doing. It's nice and sweet, it's super approachable, it's got a nice decent proof, and it's just a very well made whiskey. It's bourbon and bourbon, but it's a well made bourbon and bourbon. That Widow Jane, it had 20% rye whiskey in it, which means that's going to be a bit of a spicier, a bit of a kind of a more floral, botanical whiskey. And I think that paired really well with Dingle's own malt being a kind of a herbal, botanical, fruity malt. And I think it came through really well into a very, very nice whiskey. This was released on the 1st of August in Ireland, so it should be available most places in the world now where they're stocking it. I know they're shipping it out. It might not be available right now where you are, but it will be coming to you in the next few weeks. If you like the sound of it, I'd say definitely pick it up. If you're collecting the Wheel of the Year series, maybe get yourself a second bottle of this, because if, like me, you like a really well-made malt whiskey, you're probably going to drink a full bottle of this and you'll wish you had another one. So I'd say if you really like the sound of that bourbon and bourbon, get yourself a second bottle, because it will eventually sell out. But for me, that's about it. That's all I have to say about this whiskey. It's very nice. I put out whiskey reviews on Wednesdays. I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey on Fridays. So if you want to see more, make sure you hit subscribe, hit that thumbs up button, and let me know what other kind of whiskies you'd like to see me review on the channel. If you tried other whiskies from the Wheel of the Year series, let me know what your favorite one is. But for me, I'm definitely going to keep on enjoying this, and I'll see you next time. Sláinte.